Welcome to the fourth Gen in Conversation event on conservation's leading edges. This one is entitled Rooting Conservation in Indigenous Ways of Being. And we have with us today Egle Zent from Venezuela and Katie Kamelamela from Hawaii, who are going to be our speakers and are going to be hosting us today. So because this is a sort of special session in the series that is about Indigenous ontologies, we wanted to lead with something a little bit different rather than going straight into our rational minds. We want to get embodied and explore our relationship with the world through our bodies. So to begin with, Katie will offer us a short meditation and Egle will follow on with an offering of her own, and then we will move into the stories they have to share with us, and then questions and conversation. So Katie, please introduce yourself, and then the floor is yours.
Hi, aloha everybody. Whichever time zone you're from, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's just 8 o'clock in the morning here, and I believe it's 8 o'clock in the evening in Europe. So thank you everybody for joining wherever you're at. I'm Katie Kamalamela. I am coming to you from, I was going to say Honolulu, from Hilo, Hawaii, island of the volcanoes. And I'm currently an assistant professor at Arizona State University. We have a remote campus in Hawaii. And I'm going to start with our rooting conservation in Indigenous ways of being with a presence practice. I'm going to call it that, a presence practice I use often. So if you want to, or I encourage you to participate, since we're learning different ways of engaging with our environment and with ourselves. And just to prep everybody, after we do our short meditation, I'm going to hand it over to Egle, who's going to be sharing some music from her community so that we can extend that time and think more deeply about our connections with plants, places, and people. So I invite you all, since you're here, thank you so much, to, if you feel comfortable, closing your eyes and start thinking about, or we'll do a couple of deep breaths in. So deep breath in, deep breath out, deep breath in, deep breath out. And one more, deep breath in and deep breath out. So we'll take this time to transport yourself to a time or a place. I'm going to suggest a forest area, or if you're more comfortable in an ocean setting, that's also helpful. Bring yourself into that space. Look around you. Are there clouds? Is there wind? What does the landscape look like? Put yourself in a place that's familiar to your being and just observe. Is there wind happening or is there rain? And in this place, you brought with you an item that reminds you or takes you back to your childhood. It could be a tree, it could be a fruit, it could be a snack your grandmother made you, and you have it in your hand. And you pick it up and you smell it. You look at the exterior. You think about the memories that you have with that plant or fruit or snack. And how does it make you feel? Where does it take you? It's giving you time to sink in to the space that you're in. And how do you feel being with those memories, with those rememberings? Where does it take you to? Where does it transport you? Are you in the kitchen making the pie with your family? Are you diving in the ocean, gathering shells with your siblings? And in a little bit, I'm gonna hand it over to Egle so you can sit in that space for a little while. And while she's sharing her music, bringing in the idea of or reflecting on the memories that you're embodying and feeling at this moment, and connecting with the music Egle will be sharing, and how does that fit in their community? What type of memories are created with those sounds, with those vibrations? So Egle, if you want to share your music, we can sit in the moment and allow people to be present with their memories and their bodies.
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me. I would like to invite everybody to stay in the place that Kathy asked you to be and have a very deep self-reflection of your body. Try to feel your skin, your eyes, breathe, thinking and feeling. The myriads of entities that surround you, allow you to be alive right now, that allow you to sustain life in many ways, to provide and feel love, secure, and to think that we basically are never alone. This music is a synthesis of that. I invite you to try to allow this flute to enter your mind and your sense.
Topo tema.
Ay, yo vine.
Ahí va a cantar.
Te llamo na ako. Ye ke kini mo de bone mana. Ya ho be to wa ita kawata. Ya bone ke kuwa mama tai de. Ya ti wa na u de te be cha te le ke. To na ke u
Okay.
li ya na ma.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So Egle asked me to, I think that the music could have carried on for a long time, right? It was an inspired piece. And now with us all deeply sunken into our bodies and our senses, I'd like to invite Katie to share your story with us.
Thanks, Emily. Before I do that, I want to acknowledge or give you guys time, if you feel comfortable to, for those of you who are able to be in your places and access your memories, like, because now we're on Zoom and there's a chat box so people can participate. Maybe write a little sentence of what was the place, or what did you see, or where did you go? What was the item that you had in your hand with you when we're talking together? Oops. Can you guys hear me? I see in the chat someone said check the audio. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna invite you guys to do that. And when I do that exercise, the idea is, often when we talk about Indigenous ideas or connections to the environment, it sounds very often that it's not accessible to people who may not identify as such. And when I do that exercise, the idea is for people to reconnect to a place that they've been with their family or with their chosen family. And as Egle said, like, where's that place that makes you feel secure? Like, what is the dish that makes you feel like you're at home? And to bring in those ideas of relations, of our foods, our mountains, our waters, our plants, our animals that give us life and what we understand to be home and to be safe. And that's important because when we do talk about ways of being, for me, Native Hawaiian in a Hawaii landscape, it can be distant to those who have maybe just moved here or have no concept of our relationship with our more than human beings around us. Like the wind. Our winds have names, our waters have different names, and they're reflections of personalities created within those landscapes. And those personalities are reflected by the people in those places. So in Hawaii, we're in the North Pacific, just below the Tropic of Cancer, and we're volcanic islands. We have 13 of the 15 microclimates of the world. And most of what people see are the drier parts of Hawaii for tourism. And that's just part of Hawaii. We also have snow-capped mountains that people go snowboarding on. We have barren lava deserts that people subsist in. And so when we talk about embodying your place, we're literally talking about embodying the geography, the topography, the soils, what the water tastes like, what the rains are, how the rains are received. And I want to just acknowledge some of the ideas or some of the thoughts that people have put into the chat. Emily says that she was in the woods behind her childhood home, finding and eating wild strawberries. David was in the Nahele forest that he walks in every day and holding an orange, a treat as a child. Said went to his home country down into the trees near the river, emoji heart. Susanna had an oatmeal raisin cookie made with her father. Rest in love, Susanna, to your family, mother and father, in the sweet soil maple forest where she lives. Trish shares that making meals with her mother and making stuffed cabbage rolls and remembering that her family was loving and it was a happy moment. Manu was digging up potatoes and kumara or sweet potatoes with his father, who was a great gardener and in the hot soil of Tauranga. Thanks, Manu. And then I'm going to say Mere went to the market with her nan and then to Papamoa Beach where they would play all day and stare at the sandhopper. And so these ideas and these memories, thank you all for sharing, are related to how what we'll call Indigenous people, people who have been in a place for an extended period of time, meaning that they have an elongated relationship with seasons, with climate, long periods of time, and so adapting to those ways of being. This crowd, global diversity, is really keen to those concepts. And so my understanding is very responsive to the international ways of being. Our culture is very inviting, inviting to cultural exchanges of food and language. And it's a very special place and a very special organization. And so it's more about how do we talk to people or communities or industries or disciplines that are very attached to globalized society and ways and acceptance. In order to express your homelands and express your landscapes, it does mean that you're different and you're unique and you highlight what makes you special. And that's what I'm really calling on people to do, is to lean into who they are, the places that they love, and the practices that make their communities their communities. And I encourage people who will be joining my lab to be of the places that they do research in. So I'm Native Hawaiian and I do research in Hawaii. I often get asked if I have international sites, and I don't. And I learned that when I was attempting to find a PhD institution in New Zealand, which I've gone to many times before. And what I learned by visiting 9 different Maori or Native institutions related to land conservation was I really needed to take care of my backyard before I could go away and help other people take care of their land. And so I don't see it as a limitation of being Native Hawaiian and doing work within my Hawaiian communities. I see it as a responsibility and a privilege and a kuleana, or in order for Native Hawaiians to continue to have a relationship with their lands, we need to continue to amplify those stories, because the stories that we tell within our families, within our organizations, at national levels, international levels, are the ones that will be repeated and the ones that will be remembered. And so that's why when we go into community, a lot of the stories are repeated, not because you didn't hear them before, but because you're going to hear a new lesson, a new access point. It's similar to reading a book multiple times. You can read it one time and then 10 years later, it'll have a totally different meaning to you and keep uncovering. So in Hawaiian, the word is kauna. It's the hidden meaning of the story of the language. And I just want to mind my time. But we're going to transition to Egle, but I also just want you all to, I want to invite you guys to the chat and review some of the other stories. And I just want to thank you for sharing your memories with this group and keeping in mind that when we go into spaces with Indigenous peoples, with scientists, with businessmen, everyone has a story and everybody wants to share their story at some level. And when we share our stories, we create connections of commonality. And that's what really strengthens our ability to work together for a common cause. So thank you for allowing me to speak with you at this time.
Thank you so much, Katie. Egle, would you like to share your story?
Okay, can you see the screen, please?
Everything is great, Egle. Go ahead.
Well, I come from Venezuela. I mean, I have had the privilege to live and learn since I was very young with people from the Andes and people from the rainforest. So I'm a tropical animal, and taking into account what Emily and Susanna asked me to talk today, I'm going to share with you some of the lessons I have learned from the indigenous people in the rainforest, especially the Hoti. And this is basically a synthesis of long time learning among them and with them, walking with the Hoti. Okay. Well, I would like to say that what I'm going to talk today, I mean, in a few minutes, is something that I learned for more than 20 years. And also, like, underlined, there are like three main issues that are all the time present daily. Something that is right now more common to hear, that nature is a word that doesn't even exist among the indigenous people. They think about more like the spheres of life. And that's right there in what you might call the ontological values, the more important things. Other thing is that life by itself is sacred, just like in a thing apart from you, but more like eating is sacred, like being aware that whatever you eat is the product of another entity dying for you to be alive. And also, more than competition is an activity for I don't know, something that among Amazonian people and Andean people, rural people. It's more cooperation, collaboration, more than competition, the trigger of change and life. Hauti, as I say there, is the name of Amazonian group that is about 2,000 people. They were contacted just in the 70s, so it's people that still keep a lot of their culture, a lot of their traditions and worldview. I will share with you a few of their tenets. One of the most important one is what they call Budeknamad, which is basically a translation would be the subjective condition of the universe. This means basically that the condition of being a person, a people, is not something that reserved for Homo sapiens, but a lot of entities and actually elements of the universe that we don't consider alive are persons, are basically conscious, that they have intention, and they have the ability to change our lives, like animals, plants, stars, rocks, a lake, a mountain, is something that many of you that are listening to me probably also live out of that principle. Is basically to deal with respect the myriads of entities that surround us, and they have the same characters that we just attribute usually just to humans. The second thing is that everything is somehow interconnected. Manatudenname is something that condition that you think that you can isolate yourself, or you can isolate what we call ecosystem, and it's the opposite. Something that I might be thinking here or doing here might affecting people in Kenya or in the United States or somewhere else. So it's this complexity that we usually tend to think in Western sense that the things can be separated, divorced. For the Hoti, is the opposite. You cannot separate your body. I mean, the things that you might touch and the things that you cannot touch, like your emotions or your real deep sadness or deep gladness, is not separated from your body. Everything is affecting somehow and affecting everything that is around you. Another element that is very important is exactly for that connection and for that condition of subjectivity. Everything is changing all the time, and I want to share with you just a little important issue related to the configuration of the human body, or what we are. It's something that happens to me when I was pregnant my second time, that I wasn't aware of that, but the indigenous people were first than me. They approached me. I was collecting some mushrooms, and they told me right away that I had something that was growing inside of me. And at the beginning, I thought there was some disease or something, but actually, what they were telling me is that I was pregnant, and I was probably just 3 or 4 days pregnant, and they already saw it. So some of them approached me and said, "Don't worry, we're gonna walk with you all through the process of what it means to build a human being." And it's something really that don't trigger just logical process or like biological process, but it triggers actually a deep ontological principle that they think is related to all entities or life forms. Basically, when you are pregnant, the whole community starts somehow to guarantee that what you are growing inside of a woman womb ends up to being a real human being. And when the woman is ready to deliver the baby, the father that is there besides the mother takes the placenta and bury it close to some particular trees, and they believe that the attributes of those trees are going to transfer to the baby. But the more magical thing happens after that. The father of the creature walks for days and days and days and fabricates a little basket, and inside the basket, and being very quiet and sort of like having like spiritual connections with everything that surrounds him, he starts to pick little pieces of the forest, put it in his mouth, and put it inside in the basket. When he returns to the community after 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 days of being walking on the forest, the mother of the creature, the mother of the newborn, and also him, Robert, the little baby, the little newborn, with everything that he put in his mouth, and actually is part of the forest. They believe that everything that it was in that compound somehow integrated and made the baby spiritual sense and spiritual self, and everything that was part of that compound that the father masticated is now part of the human body of this baby, and he has the commitment to take care of every part of the forest that was inside of the mouth of the father, and those parts have the commitment to take care of him. It's a connection that accompanies you all through your life. So with those ontological principles is that everything that I can understand of the forest in the Hoti sense, it makes sense, because there is no difference between, but there is no like a separation between what is your body and what is you and what is outside or what is inside. Everything is somehow interconnected. And think about it, when I was showing you the music of Iban, and I was asking you to think about breathing. I mean, we know that the air is basically made out. I mean, it's a ecosystem service, we call it in ecology, but basically what the Hoti believe is that it's also almost like a Buddhist thing, is that everything is moving. The spheres of life is interconnected. There is no way for me to separate my air of the air that Emily is breathing or everybody else is breathing. There is no way for me to separate my dreams and everybody other person dreams. If I do it as an exercise, but many things are really interconnected and are permanently moving. The other thing that is very important is that we are not alone. The principle of life is the condition of life is social, is not individual. There is not a way. I mean, if you think about the word individual, it means really to separate, to make to make yourself like inseparable. But actually, they believe that is the opposite. That you divide. The other thing is that what I mentioned before, they strive to do the things right all the time. Is can be a little bit of anguish, but actually is to try to be good, to do good to everything that surrounds you. And it's a synthesis actually of the most important tenet of their life. In their language is called Chakwan, which it means to love and to care everything that surrounds you. It's an exercise that can be very difficult, very anguish, but it's the principle, the most important principle for them to be alive, and it's the principle that sustains life. And with those ideas, with those understandings, over more than 20 years that we have been related to the Amazonian people, we have been trying to carry on what is called the collaborative action research in basically 5 more important areas: land security and legal rights. We have helped them to use like Western tools to demarcate their lands and have legal access to their land. Language, the preservation of the language, the codification of all the environmental, ecological, and principles of life are codified in the language, in every indigenous people language, not just them. In terms of identity, health, and biological conservation, we have tried to, for the last 20 years, to carry on projects, which in fact, Global Diversity Foundation has helped us deeply to carry on these projects. I mean, this is just a little sample of the different things that we have been able to carry on walking side by side with the indigenous people, understanding their ontological values. I don't know if I talk longer than 10 minutes, sorry, but that's what I have to share with you.
Don't worry at all, Egli. Thank you so much. That was amazing. I would love to have a list of those tenants up on my wall in front of my computer so that I can remember them every day. They were just very, very moving, very moving. Thank you. So before we move into a conversation with the group, Susanna is here, and I will be asking Katie and Egle some questions about how these deeply rooted relationships interact with the concept of conservation. So please feel free to write questions in the chat that we can address, especially if you have a burning question, so you don't forget it. Put it into the chat as we talk. But for the next few minutes, we're going to ask some questions of Egle and Katie about the relationship between Indigenous peoples and conservation. So the first question I'd like to ask you both, and feel free to maybe put your hand like this if you want to answer first. The first question is, what does conservation mean for Indigenous peoples, or for the peoples that you work with?
I don't know, Kathy, you want to talk first?
You can go.
Oh, well, for my understanding of the indigenous people that I have working with, and also rural people from the Andes, local people, conservation is more like an introduced concept in itself in terms of a theory. What they daily do really is to maintain life, to try to maintain the connections, the interconnection in a very respectful way. So more than like an activity that you do outside of what you are, let's say I'm going to carry a project, a research project or a plant project, it's actually behaving like if every single tiny life form it deserves all the respect, and it's like an integrated conception. It's more like something apart that you might think. It's something that is ingrained in the daily behavior. It's like a coalition of an hyper awareness that being alive is actually thank you to myriads of entities that allowed you to be alive. It's not something that I will say that is separated as a theoretical body. That's my understanding of them, and I think I have learned from that. It's more like a commitment with protection of life and protection of and respectful protection of everything that surrounds you.
Yeah, I agree with what Egle said, and I'm also gonna add it's as Hawaii is recognized as part of being part of America, there's huge globalization that's happening, gentrification of our lands. And so one of the conversations that comes up often is the protection of our lifeways, which includes traditional ways of cooking. So cooking underground, being able to like collect firewood, being able to fish and hunt, fish in the ocean for uh, not just sustenance, but for our communities to thrive during life events and celebrate together, sharing food together from our land so that we can be connected and embody them physically is really when I engage in my communities and people talk about conservation that haven't been infiltrated by a Linnean way of what native means. I'm going to go with that. They include things that allow them to create connections with their family, to reconnect with people who have passed, to celebrate people who are to come, and to prepare our lands and our waters and our policies within government and non-governmental agencies that reflect our values, and ensuring that values that we hold in esteem are passed on within the generations. And I'm just at the age of, definitely I'm an auntie, and one of my nieces just graduated from high school, and I thought the kids are going to be okay. They have good values. They're the ones that are helping to put the celebrations together, gathering flora, gathering fauna, preparing, cooking, making sure the elders are taken care of first. And those are important values that people outside of academia are really striving to perpetuate. And the idea is that these gatherings and these celebrations which have food are indicators of how well our environment is doing. If we're able to gather certain foods, if I see certain foods on the table, then I know that one, those practices are continuing on and they're being passed on to next generations, that they're available and that they're abundant depending on where people are going to get fish or ferns or shrimp, and providing them. What is also interesting is if those foods stay on the table and they're not taken, then to me that's an indicator of a break in consuming our foods. And so one of the things that all humans share in all cultures is, maybe I'm casting too broad of a net, is celebrations. And if you're from a certain area, you expect to see certain foods to imbibe those celebrations. So that's what conservation means from my understanding, working within our communities, and also related to ceremonies, not just life events, but connecting to our akua, our environmental elements, and ensuring that they are sustained. So separate from the idea of climate change, or possibly opposite, is that when we have those ceremonies, it's so that we want to preserve climate systems. and to ensure that those systems are stabilized or revitalized if there's been a break in those cycles. So that's what conservation means for communities I work with, or my understanding of communities that I'm in and work with in Hawaii.
Yeah, I would like to add also, like, it's like the inversion of some of the values that our current system holds. I mean, instead of, for instance, something that is very, I have learned a lot among these small people, is that accumulation of anything, money, I mean, things, whatever, even food, it's almost like a cosmic sin. You do not accumulate. There is no reason to accumulate if you behave right. I mean, somehow life sustains you if you do the right things. Accumulation is somehow to take away from other people and from or other entities or other dynamics, something that might be need somewhere else. So that's, even if it seems crazy, it's tied to the idea of conservation, because conservation is somehow something that what I had seen among these small groups, something very related to equity. Everybody has a right to eat, a right to be happy, a right to love, a right to, I don't know, it's something that has to be more associated to equity, including affections, as very well Kathy was saying, related to kinship or related to the people that you decide that is close to you. They can be animals, they can be insects, they can be the air, everything that is part of the sphere of life, including, for instance, something that might be very non-understandable, like is killing, like is hunters. I mean, the Hoti are fundamentally hunter-gatherers. So for me, it was difficult to understand this way of respecting if you kill the animal. And so they have like all this wonderful set of ritual that is not like something that is disassociated to the daily life, and it's basically a respectful way of saying thank you. We are alive, thank you to this dynamic that we don't break. So basically being alive is guaranteeing that all the connections with the different spheres are proper. But in that way, it's sort of inverting the dynamic of the Western society with accumulation and having like a lot of poverty in some areas, a lot of like, I don't know, a lot of imposition of many things, racism, and so many other dynamics that you don't really see in a meaningful way in these small communities, in smaller communities, or communities, I say, that have the values that probably we hold like 200,000 years ago, and we don't have it anymore, and we're trying to rescue.
So that leads me, maybe starting with you, Katie, or whoever is inspired, into this question of how do we, to use your word, Egle, rescue, but how do we truly decolonize conservation practice? How might some of these ways of conserving and being in collaboration with, being part of, be restored? Or how are you restoring them? If restoring is the right word, I'll stop.
So, thanks, Egle. I think in Hawaii, it's really the return to people to lands. It's a common story that Indigenous peoples are removed from their land so that other industries have access to resources, whether it's minerals, flora, fauna, any of those items. And so the return to land is really where the magic happens. And conservation is inherently colonizing. And sometimes in conversations seen as a byproduct of the military industrial complex to do the re-aiding of lands and restoration or revitalization of resources that have been extracted, if they get to that point. And so I think it's more about, instead of focusing on the colonizing and the colonizers, like, how do we focus on the values and the indicators that these communities uphold to identify that they're thriving as a cohesive unit, as intergenerational cogs in a continuing system that will persist beyond our own breaths? How do we ensure that the work that we're doing reflects those values? And so in our work, we use within the scientific community biocultural indicators. So instead of only water quality or soil science, have dragonflies been reintroduced to the estuary system after we have replanted those areas? Is the water cool enough so that when we plant taro in wetland systems, the corms don't rot? Is the amount of taro being harvested distributed to elders and processed so that they can eat? So those are very different indicators that you would use or are currently being used for governments to measure impact. And so those are the broader impacts that our communities are interested in and that make sense for monitoring. I suggest that when we work with communities, it's like, what is the end goal that you would like to achieve? And oftentimes that goal is beyond their lifespan. So how do we work backwards from that idealized state? And what are the steps that we need to get to achieve that goal? And that's a different way of being than a 2-year or a 5-year or even a 10-year grant. So those are just some suggestions on how we can approach reintegrating or uplifting Indigenous voices. And I think, just to be fair, when Indigenous communities are removed, and if we use those stats that Indigenous communities steward 80 up to 85% of biodiversity in the world, but make up 5% of the world's population, is it really fair to put all of that onus on people who are marginalized and pushed to the fringe while continuing like business as usual science and conservation? Where are we providing or empowering these biodiversity system stewards agency to continue that work beyond the reserves that many are limited to? Okay, and see, Egle.
I totally agree with Kari. I also would like to add that the land is absolutely central. I mean, it's not just a symbolical thing. And well, some of us have been for, I don't know, at least for 30 years trying exactly to advocate that and to somehow to increase the awareness of the rights that are the fairness of the. When I use the word restoring, is basically trying to say that health, I mean, land, language, identity are basic human rights that have been denied to many indigenous and local people in many ways. And probably in the last 5 to 10 years, there has been like an increase of awareness worldwide of how unfair that has been. And so there are like a in many contexts from academia and from NGOs has been a genuine increase, not just of awareness, but also of projects and actions to try to give the people the I don't know, the autonomy to be able to have like land rights, health rights in their own terms, in their own, with their own voices. But there is still a lot to do. I mean, when we talk about colonization, or decolonization, is not just about a process of walking with them side by side, offering them the tools for them to have the total autonomy, but it's respecting also their ways. And sometimes it's a real challenge to sort of like integrate the indigenous people ways and the Western ways in terms of like the people who has the power, the money, or the control, being then governments or institutions or companies that are side by side with these indigenous people, and they have the power to change their lives, or to don't give their lands, or to contaminate their lands, or to extract, as Kathy said. So I think an extremely important role of ethnobiologists nowadays is exactly not just to advocate in terms of education from every place that we are, because it's an ethical principle, but also like sort of have an engaged commitment. I mean, we cannot start any project that doesn't have a decolonial or whatever the indigenous people call it, but a way of having them to have more power to walk in the way they want, to have the decision to do the way they want it, even if it's different to what we think is the best for them. I mean, it has been often that in our own projects, I mean, I can remember right now when we were helping two different indigenous people from the Amazon to demarcate their land, their traditional land, and they come up with a decision that from our perspective was not favorable for both of them, but that's what they wanted. So that's when you yourself said you had to respect the autonomy for them to take the decision they want. I think our role is to try to be there and try for them to have that autonomy, to have all the tools and the possibility to really walk in the way they want. So I think it's a huge role for us ethnobiologists to try to really impulsate the decolonization walk. I mean, in a more recent way, like Susanna and Emily are very aware, I mean, we try to help the indigenous people with their health issues that are more, I don't know, more, let's say, more tough and complex to get, but it has to be a huge component of autonomy to talk about decolonial thing. It has to be a huge component of how the people want to do it. And in our part, a lot of humility, a lot of like being sure that even if we are there to try to help, it's very important for the indigenous people to have all the autonomy to decide how they want to do these things. I don't know, there is a lot that we can say about this issue, and it's complex, and it has to be very situated, very contextualized. You cannot extrapolate these notions from not even in the Amazon, not even among one ethnic group or indigenous people to another indigenous people. It has to be extremely situated. So I think in our individual notion of ethnobiology, of how we want to call ourselves, it has to be a lot of humility. I think that's a starting point, and also like a deep knowledge of how the context is modulated, how the interactions are understood, and how the people ended up having the decisions. I mean, it's my contribution to this. And I think it's another element that is extremely important is that we should advocate for education in any context we are. Is education for me is the clue. I mean, to start teaching the little people and the big people and the old people and all the people that do not have a notion of what it means, the complexity of the coloniality that we live in, and how we benefit from those colonial processes. I think education is a clue. I mean, we had to educate ourselves and educate whoever is around us to realize that how things that are given to us are probably part of a colonial process that is very complex.
Thank you so much, Egle, and thank you so much, Katie. We have one question in the chat, and I also have a question for you, Katie, but the question in the chat comes from Said. I think Indigenous peoples have the right to treat every stranger with caution, because we all know what the beginning of colonialism was like and the companies left behind that drain the resources of these communities. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We even advocate that to them. People I mean, in the case of the Hoti, I mean, they are, I don't know. I mean, they are one of the more nicest people I ever met, and they can be, in that sense, is one of the things we can actually help them, and they are asking us more often than before, is to be very careful. I totally agree with what Said said. They had to be extremely careful. People that might come with an agenda that might be very nice and very good might actually have a different agenda. So I think people has to have the right to have as long as they want to answer for a decision if they allow you to visit them or to do what you think they want to do in your communities. And they have a right to actually impose on you whatever rules they think are proper. And something that I actually had a meeting yesterday with some people from academia, they have a right to ask you something on return from whatever you do in their communities, even just to see, even just to visit. They have a right to say, okay, you're allowed to come in here, but we want this and this and this, or we need this and this and this. Absolutely, they have the right. I totally agree with what Said said.
Yeah, and I also support that. And now the lines are getting a little muddled. Like, I'm Native Hawaiian, working in Native Hawaiian communities. And just because I'm Native Hawaiian, it doesn't mean that I get a pass into any community. It's similar and sometimes more onerous to be from your community doing work in your community. There's still relationships that need to be built, trust that needs to be built. And also, besides just the idea of trusting people from the outside, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, it's also an idea to advocate for what do you want in your community. There's a lot of, we don't want this, we don't want that, because those need to be had and those protests need to be heard. And in the same time, I advocate for people to be like, okay, that is not ideal. So what is the preference for the community? What is your end goal? And how can we help you get there? We may not be able to provide all support for 100%. But if we don't know, or if you haven't had those conversations in your own community, then it's going to be more challenging for other people who genuinely want to support your mission and your vision to provide any type of even monetary or moral support. So be cautious and know what your mission is in your community, how you're organized, know your own internal organization structure so that you know what your chain of command, we'll call that, or consensus process is, so that when somebody does come and seems genuine and you've built that relationship, you're also prepared to facilitate what you want to see in your community. So you can be defensive, but you also need an offensive plan. Like, what are you going to do actively to ensure that your community's needs are met besides protesting? What is your offense? Who are the relationships, or what are the positions in your community or the external government systems that you need to communicate with to ensure your goals can be achieved? If not in this life, you can achieve some goals so the next generation doesn't have to deal with the same issues, which is what I've experienced in my community. Is we just want to get through this problem and this problem so the next generation can tackle the next problem. And sometimes it's a laddered effect, it's a staircase effect. So know what you need and know what is best for your communities.
Yeah.
I would direct both of you to the chat because there are a number of interrelated questions, some of which, frankly, are huge and probably more than we can resolve here. But please see them. Yeah, Aglé.
I thank you for pointing that, Susana. I wanted to mention Emmanuel. he said in the chat, how can we end up this issue of violation of indigenous rights? And that's a huge question. I mean, I can tell you how we have been trying to approach that. One of the most important things is that we have been sort of a tool for them at least for 20 years. I mean, it's like when we are in their lands, I mean, they usually ask us to start different projects or start different things. And we ended up being like technicians or facilitators or mediators, but allowing them to walk and to having the limits and the borders of what do they think are the rights, also to being like mediators from the local communities with the outside world, with what is going on in terms of, for instance, making sure that we translate the human rights, indigenous people, the declarations of the rights, being sure that everybody's aware of that, being sure that they are connected to international laws, even if they are not seeing these people from the outside. There is people that would be willing to defend the rights. I know there are small things, but I think as much as we try to join forces with people that are similar in our thinking, we can try to stop process of destruction or deepening the violations of indigenous people rights. So I think what in our case is a life commitment. It's something you do every day, you do it all the time, you do it permanently, and you try to instigate other people that is besides you to join you. But it's something that clearly, I mean, we are aware that, let's call it that way, the enemy is huge. It's much bigger than us. But it doesn't mean that we cannot try all the time to stop the violation, even a small violation, huge violation and small violations. Then David says it's not important to teach all children early in life how to become indigenous, connected, and part of it. Absolutely. I agree totally with you, David. I try to do it, even with students and with other people that is beside me, with my neighbors, trying to show, because, I mean, there is a lot of prejudices everywhere with indigenous, for indigenous and local people of color. So I think we should become a tool permanently of trying to stop the violations. And I don't know if Kathy want to add something to what I said. I don't want to.
Yeah, I think, where is it in the chat? I think responding to Emmanuel about people being evicted, that's like an ongoing, like historical and ongoing issue. And so how do we provide support to people who are being evicted? And so there's a lot of layers there, right? There's people who need to take care of themselves personally, their immediate families, their extended families, and all of those levels could include the land. And there is historic continuance of indigenous or people who have extended relationships with the land being moved to new lands and then restarting over in those areas, becoming or familiarizing themselves with new trees for firewood that were not available in their original lands, adapting practices so that cultural diets can continue. Sometimes it's languages are outlawed. So then the environmental language that communities have created are, the word broken comes to mind, but I'm also going to go with misplaced because you're removed from those areas. And so what I see in different communities is people choose their hard. They choose the language or the dance or the food or the taking care of the land. And some people play multiple of those roles because of the support that they have within their families. And most times, in my experience, those people have intergenerational access to land, even though they've been removed 6 generations ago. And so you need to recognize, how can you exert your personal sovereignty to ensure your connection to your lands? And how can you express that in a way that inspires people around you to take action in ways that are most aligned with who they are and the gifts that they have. I was very angry for at least 10 years after learning the true history of our people, the banning of language, the banning of foods, the banning of dance, the banning of medicinal practices. And I, at this point, have transmuted most of that anger into doing things like these presentations and providing an example, one of many out there that people can choose from, on how they can choose their heart and advocate for life ways that are important to my self-identity and my community. So once you express and people see you being yourself and being the example, you can create community around that and inspire others to do what needs to be done in their communities, so that life ways, is probably the best way to say it, are preserved and perpetuated and taught to the next generation. Some people just focus on toddlers. Some people only focus on teenagers. People become specialized in their cultures, in their language, in their ways of being, and focus their energy. Like, I focus on adults, people who may have not had access to land, language, resources, mentorship, to show that if you have an inquisitiveness within you, then you should pursue that. And that is for you to discover what it is. It's not a clean answer to your question and to your sentiment, Emmanuel, but it's just a starting point, I would say. And I don't know specifically what's going on in Kenya. I can only share what's going on in Hawaii. But the greatest strength is for Indigenous communities to collaborate with each other and cross-pollinate our experiences so that we know that we're not alone. And once we realize that we're not alone and we share in these challenges together in different parts of the world, we're able to compare notes. And it's kind of like school. It's how I did school, is the generation above me gave me their notes, so I didn't need to learn everything from scratch. I got their cliff notes and I learned from that, so I didn't have to make the same mistakes they did. And so I give people my cliff notes so that they can learn from my mistakes. And the best way to move forward is not to make the mistake yourself, but to take that lesson and apply it in your place, whatever may be transferable. So that's my offering. And there's really good conversation going on in the chat. So thank you, Pete. Thank you for putting your ideas in there and asking and expressing yourself.
Thank you so much, Katie. Something that you said reminded me of the question I wanted to ask you, especially when you mentioned, having to become Indigenous again, in a space of displacement. The question actually I want to ask you is, because I know that you've written an amazing and very inspiring article on this with your colleagues, on the concepts of native and invasive, and how conservation, top-down conservation, decides what is native, what is invasive, and the Indigenous peoples, with their relational approach to lifeways and connection, have very different understandings of that.
Yeah, thank you, Emily, for bringing that up. It's the language we use is important, whether it's in English, whether it's our Indigenous languages, and the idea of invasive and or native and invasive plants can and has created in some areas confusion on what relationships are more important or less important. And in our paper, which includes Hawaii, New Zealand, and some First Nations and American Indians, is that although some invasive species may be classified as such by science, because of movement of indigenous peoples and reduced access to native resources, some of these invasive species have been adopted as kinfolk, and are used as substitutions for resources that are either no longer available or limited. Are they the same caliber? That's up to the community to decide. And the use of invasive species can also be used as a mechanism for curbing that invasiveness. In Hawaii, we have an algaroba species, Kiave. It's a Fabaceae, it's a bean. It has a bean and has very hard wood. It's originally from South America. I want to say from Chile, and it goes all the way up to the Southwest as a naturalized, possibly, species. And so it was brought to Hawaii by a Frenchman in the late 1800s. And now, with our underground oven practices, it's one of the most preferred woods because of how hard it is and because of the taste. People say that it imparts. Another name for it is mesquite. And so to keep in mind that when we're working with indigenous communities, there was one community that had some plants on there that weren't native in a scientific sense. And because we're working on a management plan for them, I didn't correct them because they're the ones that are going to be doing the work on their lands. And so to be cognizant of that may not be what I was taught, but this is how they live. And to be respectful and supportive of, if these are the people going to be doing this work for generations to come, then they should be able to determine the relationships that they want to enhance moving forward. Is it ideal for conservationists within science? Usually not, and it also creates a lot of dissonance and confusion in the head, and it's also part of the process. We provided social constructs to identify plants or animals that can infringe or impact economic viability of agricultural landscapes. That is my understanding of how invasive species are classified as such, is because they have an economic impact on government management of lands and resources. And so if we look at it in that context, then how we work on it on small scales in limited areas should be taken into consideration. And maybe we can even learn something from that. So, Egle, do you have anything you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, I would like to say that I loved your paper when I read it, and it came to my mind like two important examples of the people that I've been living with. One is like the musa, I mean the banana is actually from Southeast Asia, domesticated, but what it was introduced in the Amazon like about 400 years ago. But it's so important among many native people that it's actually one of the plants that consolidate humanity in their narratives and the mythological narratives. So it's amazing. Like among the Yanomami, I mean, when you bury your relatives when they are dying, you had to after 7 years you prepare some kind of like a soup or something with plantain and with the remains of your relatives. And among the Hoti, you have like two different narratives of anthropogony. One of them explain and it's fascinating because one of them is like what they call Nunha de Bada. It's like the real people, the Amazonian people was made of plants, native, let's say emergent trees from the Amazon, but the people that migrated later, like they are made out of plantain, which is the main staple food, which is very interesting because plantain doesn't need basically any care. They just grow anywhere in the Amazon, and I mean it's actually very, very neat. And in the other thing that resonated a lot to me is like the other area where I have learned and lived for a number of years is in the high Andes. Actually, there is in Hawaii some area that is like that. In Venezuela, we call it Paramo. I mean, Colombia and Ecuador, we call it the high Andes. And the native people from there, they, exactly as you say in your paper, they do not consider, like, they do not have that division of native and foreign plants. Native is any single plant that love to stay there and just blows in there. Any plant that can actually adapt to the very difficult conditions of the high Andes, because it's like many of them had to frozen during the night and then unfrozen during the day, because it's a tropical area like Hawaii. So some time of the day they are very, very low temperatures, but some other times it's very hot. So whatever animal or plant that lives in the Paramo is native, because they decide to stay in there and live in there. So it's very alike to the notion that you mentioned, that is the local people who decide what is native. And if you think about it, it's exactly as you said, it is a commercial term. They are invasive when they are not good for economy, but they are welcome when you just create a monocultivated plantation. They are not considered invasive, even if they are brought. So thank you. I mean, I think you have a wonderful weaving of ideas there that make you shake the notions that we have.
Thank you so much. Oh, Katie, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to connect with what Egle said. So Native Hawaiians come from the taro plant. It's our elder sibling. The taro was born by our gods before we were. And so it is, and the taro was a migration plant that came down through China and Taiwan and the greater South Pacific and came up to the North Pacific with us. And so that's the same idea, is that this plant that wasn't native to the climates or to these islands that are so isolated are native to our culture and to our cosmogonic genealogies. And so those are examples that reflect the plantain that Egle talked about. So it's probably more common because prior to globalization, everybody was, I want to go with limited to the food that they could cultivate or hunt or gather. And that's when we transitioned into domestication and naturalization of plants, and, you know, animals also moved with us. We brought the pig to Hawaii, and it made its way all the way down from China, with our ancestors started that journey from the continent onto our islands. So the movement of plants and the movement of animals is because of people. And we need to think about that. I understand that we have economic viability and needs, but before an industrial complex, we still have communities who are isolated that are not so interdependent on globalized industries and still prefer to be connected with diets and ceremonies and celebrations that they've been brought up with. So just having those considerations. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you so much, both. Are there any other questions? We do have another question in the chat here that has come from Susanna, and it was related to what you were both saying before. It says, if you steward land that is not your traditional land, how do you work actively to collaborate with the traditional owners and stewards of that place? And I would even say with all the entities of that place that you've come to.
I will ask Susanna to elaborate a little more. I read it and I wasn't completely sure if I understood what the first thing that I thought when I read the question was, we need to hear or to understand very well the story. I mean, before like having a strategy to help. it's good to have like a diachronic, like a historical perspective, or the land per se. I mean, I remember the very first time I went to the Hoti land, the Hoti territory, and when we tried to tell them that they needed to have a legal document to say that that was their land, that was like over 30 years ago. They didn't really understand what I was talking about it, and they told me that it's impossible that you, as a human, own the land. Their answer was the land on us. We are like, in terms of private property, was not a notion that you can connect. Like if you have a knife or a piece of, I don't know, a piece of cloth or shoes or something that you can say are mine. For them, they didn't even have a word in the language to say, this is my land, because the notion of private property didn't really exist until, I don't know, 15 years later, when mining and the government start to really threaten their presence there, like somebody in the chat put, and they start to threaten them with being evicted. That is when we planted the notion of private property. So you see, from my perspective, it's very complex, that notion. So I will say, like, the first thing you had to know is sort of like the history, but if Susanna can elaborate a little bit, I probably can answer better.
I'm aware of our time. This is Susanna now connecting from my phone as I go to pick up my daughter from the forest.
Oh.
So I'm thinking, Agley, of a place that you've been, which is the land that we steward, which we call a farm. But we know that it has been a site of gathering and flint knapping, so tool making for thousands of years. And I'm very aware that I am a settler and I'm tending land that doesn't belong to me. And I appreciate your distinction of ownership. The traditional owners here, primarily the Western Abenaki, would say that there is no ownership, or the traditional owners are the gods, and people are the stewards. So I'm thinking about beyond in land that it was appropriated and violently taken a long time ago, and which is now settler occupied. How to reconnect and support processes of reconnection as an ally, not on my own traditional land. And I think that's plenty to say about that for now. I want to leave our remaining time for others' questions.
There is actually a question that has come in, which I think is quite interesting, from Manu. Any suggestions on how to, we're moving into Indigenous knowledge. Any suggestions on how to navigate free, prior, and informed consent when one group of Indigenous peoples want to use an Indigenous organism for commercial purposes, when many other groups have rights and responsibilities for the same species?
Yeah, I don't know if Kathy wants to address that. I mean, I have an example of that. Do you want to mention something, or do you want to?
Okay, yeah, Katie, maybe you go, and then Egley, you can join in.
I'm gonna assume Manu is talking about something in New Zealand, and I feel, as someone who's not Maori, that would probably happen at the different tribal levels, and also engage governance of the federal government of New Zealand as a beginning part. That sounds very complex, and unless there's proprietary connection with genetic engineering, which has a different set of protocols and ethics, that would definitely be for sure a meeting of people who are responsible for taking care of that organism in different organizations, having a meeting and a discussion prior to moving forward, at least so that people are touching bases. But I also want to listen to or hear Egley's example.
Well, is when there is, for instance, one plant or one organism, or even the baskets or something that you cannot really assume that is the intellectual property right of a single group. For instance, something like is commonly used in the Amazon, and you have like 40 different indigenous people, different indigenous ethnic groups using exactly the same plant or animal exactly in the same way. So that creates really a conflict, because you're talking about intellectual property right that was probably shared since, I don't know, 15,000 or 20,000 years ago. So it's more like a common product. Huh? So, and that's something that it can be also being contested when you're talking about other like microbiome or blood components, that kind of thing that can be very tricky. I mean, the suggestions in some of the areas can be to add a layer of I don't know, common ground property rights, and is shared by everybody. I mean, we had one example but it's a small group still, but it compound like 4 different ethnic groups that 4 of them claim to have the same kind of basketry and the same process, the same way to do it, and somehow they had like a big assembly, and they got the recognition, the legal recognition to have the intellectual property right, all of them. But when it's something extremely common, I mean, that is shared by, I don't know, 100,000 people, is more complex. So my suggestion in that case is actually to having different assemblies, and it depends on the particular piece of if it's a matter, of it's an idea, of it's a narrative that you think it can have a share or a common ground to have a free informed consent. But it's something that it must be done. I don't think that even if it's common, it should not be part of a conversation of to have a free agreement. I think it's very important to institute that.
Thank you, Egle. Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Manu, for your question. And on that note, we have reached the end of our session. I would be happy to welcome any final questions for those who wish to remain, if it's short, but I think that I think that we're going to close it. So I would like to thank you so much, Katie and Egle, for your generosity with all your reflections and your meditation as we started the session. And thank you everyone for your great questions. Yeah, it's been a really inspiring hour and a half for me. So thank you everyone. And here it's now 9:30 p.m. So it's the end of my day. So good night and have a good day.